The sound was sharp, final, not loud but heavy with years of unspoken resentment. It was the sound of a fork hitting a plate, and it was the sound that split my life into two parts, the time before and the time after. My daughter, Chloe, her face a mask of frustration I knew all too well, had just shattered the fragile piece of our Sunday dinner. "It's not a business, Dad," she seethed, her eyes flashing. Those words were just the first crack in a dam that was about to break wide open. But to understand the flood that followed, you first have to understand the rain in Port Blossom. The rain here has a way of getting into your bones. It's not a dramatic, thundering rain, but a persistent, soul-dampening drizzle that turns the sky into a sheet of gray flannel for 9 months of the year. That Sunday was no different. Outside the dining room window, water dripped from the heavy branches of the Douglas firs I'd planted with my late wife Eleanor 30 years ago. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. We were going through the motions of a family dinner. The silence between bites was thick. My granddaughter, 16-year-old Maya, was expertly scrolling through her phone, a shield against the tension. 12-year-old Leo was pushing his green beans around his plate, creating little dams in his mashed potatoes. My son-in-law Derek was eating with the vacant, unbothered expression of a man who has perfected the art of not being present in his own life. And then there was Chloe. At 43, she wore her disappointment like a permanent coat. I had made my signature pot roast, the one Eleanor had taught me, the one Chloe used to beg for as a kid. Now, she was sawing at it like it was a chore. I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. So, I began, aiming for casual. "How did that presentation go last week? For that water filter business?" And that's when it happened. Chloe's fork slammed down. The sharp, final sound made Leo jump. "It's not a business, Dad. It's an investment opportunity. And it didn't go well because we couldn't secure the initial capital." Her eyes, so much like her mother's but without any of the warmth, flicked to me. "The bank said our debt-to-income ratio is too high for an unsecured loan." The unspoken accusation hung in the air between us. And whose fault is that? Derek continued to chew his roast, his eyes fixed on the wall behind me, a professional at letting Chloe fight the battles he should have been fighting himself. I took a slow sip of water. I'd been a carpenter for 45 years. I knew how to measure twice and cut once, not just with wood but with words. Well, these things can be tricky. Maybe it's for the best. Some of those multi-level marketing setups are... "Oh, here we go," she cut me off, pushing her chair back slightly. "St. Arthur, the king of caution. Dad, you don't get it. We need to take risks, to build something for ourselves. We can't just live under your shadow forever." The word shadow landed like a stone in my gut. For 18 years, my shadow had paid the mortgage on this house. My shadow had co-signed for her car, paid for Maya's braces, and quietly slipped them thousands of dollars when Derek was between opportunities. I looked around the dining room at the solid oak table I built, at the roof over their heads that my pension checks kept secure. I hadn't built a shadow. I thought I'd built a foundation. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "Chloe, all I've ever done is try to help." That was the moment the dam broke. She stood up, her face a mask of pure frustration. "Help?" she said, her voice rising with a raw, bitter edge. "You call this helping? Dad, we are drowning. We are suffocating under the weight of your help. Every dollar you give us is just another chain. We can't make a move, can't take a risk, can't even breathe without feeling you hovering over us." She took a deep breath, and the final words came out not in a shout, but in a low, cold, devastatingly clear tone. "Honestly, Dad, the biggest relief would be not having to worry about you anymore, in any capacity." Time stopped. The rain outside seemed to fade away. It wasn't just the words. It was the chilling sincerity behind them. Her life would be easier if I simply ceased to be. Gone. Vanished. The fork in my hand felt impossibly heavy. I looked from Chloe's hard, defiant face to Derek's cowardly avoidance. No one spoke. No one defended me. I slowly placed my napkin on the table. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a stranger's in my own ears. "I think I need some air." I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving my family sitting in the ruins of a life I had apparently destroyed by trying to build it. I didn't grab a jacket. The cold, misty rain felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Each step on the slick flagstones leading to my workshop was deliberate, slow. My body felt heavy, ancient. It wasn't the 68 years on my bones, it was the weight of that one sentence. The biggest relief would be not having to worry about you anymore. It was a clean cut, severing something I didn't even know could be broken. I wasn't angry. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. And what I felt was the opposite, a cold, clean hollowness, as if someone had reached into my chest and neatly scooped everything out. The world had gone quiet, except for the soft, rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof of the shed. The old brass key turned smoothly in the lock. Pushing the heavy cedar door open, the scent of my life washed over me, the sharp, clean perfume of pine sawdust, the faint tang of wood varnish, and the metallic smell of cold steel from my tools. This was my sanctuary. Every saw hung in its place. Every chisel was sharpened to a perfect edge. Every stack of lumber was neatly arranged by species and size. For 45 years, this was the world I could control. A world of straight lines, precise measurements, and tangible results. You put the work in, and you got a chair, a table, a home. It was an honest transaction. Inside the house, I just learned, the math was different. The more you put in, the less you were worth. I didn't turn on the main overhead lights, just a small lamp over my workbench that cast a warm, golden circle in the otherwise cool darkness. My hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of labor, trailed over the surface of a half-finished project on the bench, a small rocking horse for Leo. I'd started it for his last birthday and gotten sidetracked. Now I ran my palm over the smooth, sanded curve of its back. The wood was solid, predictable, honest. I traced the grain with my thumb and thought of all the things I had built for them. Maya's first crib, the bookshelves that lined their living room, the deck where they held summer barbecues they occasionally remembered to invite me to. Each project was an act of love, a piece of myself given freely. I saw them now for what they were in Chloe's eyes. Not gifts, but monuments to her own failure, reminders of her dependency. My eyes drifted to a dusty shelf in the corner, to a silver frame holding a picture of Eleanor. It was from our trip to the Oregon coast, maybe a year before she got sick. Her hair was caught in the wind, and she was laughing, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that always made my heart ache. I picked it up, wiping the dust from the glass with my sleeve. "Well, Elle," I whispered to the empty shed, my voice sounding rough and unused. "You heard her, didn't you? You always said I was too soft on her. You said she mistook the safety net for a hammock. Eleanor had been the realist, the one who saw Chloe's budding entitlement for what it was. I was the optimist, the one who always believed that one more act of generosity, one more helping hand, would be the one that finally earned their gratitude. I had been a fool. The realization didn't come with a flash of anger, but with a quiet, profound sadness. The family I had been working for, sacrificing for, no longer existed. Maybe it never had. It was just a story I told myself, a beautiful structure I'd built in my mind to house a rotten foundation. They didn't see me as a father or a grandfather. I was a utility, a resource, a living, breathing insurance policy they resented paying the premiums on. And Chloe's words were just the official notice of cancellation. "We no longer require your services." I sat down on an old wooden stool, the photo of Eleanor still in my hands. The rain pattered a soft, lonely rhythm on the tin roof. I thought about what it meant to not be worried about. It meant to not be thought of, to not matter, to be an inconvenience whose absence was preferable to his presence. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it. She had said it in front of her children. She wanted them to hear it, to understand that my role in their lives was a burden she was ready to shed. She wasn't just ending our relationship. She was erasing my legacy. I placed the photo back on the shelf, my movements slow and deliberate. The grief was sharp, not for the daughter I had, but for the one I realized I'd never had. The hollow space in my chest was starting to fill up now, not with warmth or anger, but with something cold, hard, and heavy, something that felt an awful lot like resolve. I stared down at my hands, resting on my denim-covered knees. They're a carpenter's hands, a roadmap of a life spent making and mending. There's a silvery scar on my left thumb from a slipped chisel back in '98, a permanent callus on my right palm from the handle of a hammer, and faint white lines crisscrossing my knuckles from countless splinters and scrapes. These hands built my life, built Eleanor's and my home, and, as I was now painfully aware, they had built the very cage my daughter claimed to be trapped in. The memory didn't surface gently. It arrived like a sudden squall, pulling me back 18 years to a Sunday that was almost identical to this one gray, drizzling, and deceptively calm before the storm. I was 50 then, still strong and working 60-hour weeks, running my own small contracting business. Eleanor was alive, and her laughter was the engine that powered our home. She'd been tired that afternoon, I remember that now. A deep, persistent weariness that we'd brushed off as the flu, but was really the quiet, insidious beginning of the illness that would eventually take her. The doorbell rang just as we were sitting down with the Sunday paper. It was Chloe and Derek, with 2-year-old Maya balanced on Chloe's hip. But this wasn't the hard, resentful Chloe from dinner tonight. This was a younger version, her face puffy and stained with tears, her entire body trembling with a desperate, frantic energy. Derek stood behind her, looking at his shoes, the very picture of a man defeated by circumstances he'd had a large hand in creating. "Dad," Chloe had sobbed, practically falling into my arms. "They're selling the building. We got the notice. We have 60 days to get out, and the bank rejected our application." She thrust a crumpled letter at me, the bold, impersonal type of the bank's logo, a stark contrast to her raw human panic. Application denied. The reasons were all there: insufficient credit history, unstable employment, a debt-to-income ratio that was laughable. Derek had been let go from his warehouse job a month prior, another in a long line of jobs that were never quite the right fit. We brought them inside, and Eleanor made tea while I tried to make sense of the situation. They'd found a house, a small but sturdy rambler over on Maple Street. It was in a good school district, had a little yard for Maya to play in. It was their dream, they said, the key to their stability. All they needed was a cosigner, someone to just help them get their foot in the door. Later that evening, after they'd gone home with a fragile, manufactured hope, Eleanor and I sat in the living room. She held her teacup in both hands, staring into the middle distance. "Arthur, don't," she said softly. Her voice was never sharp, but it had a tensile strength that I always respected. "They're not ready for this. Derek is a ship without a rudder, and Chloe, she thinks a mortgage is just a number on a piece of paper. If we do this, we're not co-signing alone. We're adopting a house payment for the rest of our lives." She was right, of course. Her clarity cut through my emotional fog. She saw the future with a pragmatism I often lacked. But then I thought of little Maya, of her tiny hand gripping my finger. I thought of my own daughter's desperate face. My role as I saw it was to be a builder, a fixer. This was a problem, and I had the tools to fix it. "It'll be different once they have something of their own, Elle," I argued. "More to convince myself than her. It'll force them to be responsible. Having a home, it grounds people." It was the great, flawed logic of a provider, the belief that a material gift could magically instill character. The next week, I was at the bank with them. The loan officer, a man named Peterson with tired eyes, laid the papers on the table and made it painfully clear. "Just so we're all on the same page," he'd said, looking directly at me, "this loan is being approved based on Mr. Corrigan's financials and creditworthiness. For legal purposes, he will be the primary name on the deed. Chloe and Derek will be listed as residents." I'd nodded, a feeling of paternal pride swelling in my chest. I was doing it. I was giving my family the foundation they needed. I signed on the dotted line, the ink from my pen sealing a contract whose true cost I wouldn't understand for nearly 2 decades. When we walked out of the bank into the pale Washington sunlight, Chloe had thrown her arms around me. Her tears this time were of gratitude. "Thank you, Daddy," she'd whispered into my shoulder. "Thank you. We'll make you so proud. We'll pay you back for every penny. I swear it." Back in the cold, dark shed, the echo of that promise was a bitter mockery. I swear it. The memory offered no comfort, only a harsh, clarifying light on the truth. Eleanor had been right. That day at the bank wasn't a rescue. It was a transaction. I had traded my financial freedom for a feeling of fatherly purpose, and in doing so, I had signed away my daughter's respect. I hadn't built them a foundation. I had built them a cage, and handed my daughter a set of resentments she would spend the next 18 years sharpening into a weapon. And tonight, she had finally used it on me. The rain had eased to a fine mist by the time I walked back to the house. The warmth inside felt artificial, and the lingering smell of pot roast was cloying, a memory of a happiness that had never really been there. The dining room was exactly as I'd left it, plates half-eaten, napkins crumpled, Chloe's chair still pushed back at an aggressive angle. They hadn't even bothered to clear the table. They had simply left the mess for someone else to handle. As always. For a brief moment, the old familiar instinct kicked in the urge to tidy up, to restore order. I almost picked up Derek's plate, but my hand stopped midair. No, not this time. The mess was theirs. Let them sit with it. Instead, I walked down the hall to my small office. It was more of a large closet, really, but it was a place of order. In the corner, next to an old leather armchair, was a sturdy 4-drawer filing cabinet. I hadn't opened the bottom drawer in years. It was where I kept the past. I flicked on the desk lamp, pulled out shoebox after shoebox filled with old bank statements and canceled checks, and set them on the floor, the air filled with the dry, dusty smell of old paper. For the next 3 hours, I conducted an audit of my own life. This wasn't an emotional journey anymore. I was beyond that. This was a job. I was a builder assessing a failing structure, and I needed to see the blueprints of the disaster. I opened my old laptop, created a new spreadsheet, and began to enter the numbers, line by painstaking line. The process was methodical, almost meditative. Each number I typed was a ghost, a small piece of a sacrifice I had made willingly, lovingly, and foolishly. First, the big one, the house. I found the original closing documents, the down payment I'd loaned them, $25,000. Then came the mortgage. For 18 years, for 216 months, I had either paid it directly or transferred the money. A cold, hard $287,208. But that was just the foundation. I kept digging. A statement from 2011 showed a $5,500 transfer to pay off a credit card Chloe had maxed out. A check from 2015 made out to Port Blossom Auto Repair for $3,200 for a new transmission for Derek's truck. A wire transfer from a frigid January in 2018 for $4,800 for a new furnace after theirs finally died from neglect. Then came the death by 1,000 cuts. The smaller, relentless expenses, checks for summer camps, ATM withdrawals before their family vacations, the $1,500 for Maya's orthodontics. It was an endless, flowing river of my money into the black hole of their lives. At 2 a.m, I stopped. My back ached, and my eyes burned from staring at the screen. I moved the cursor, letting it hover over the sum function at the bottom of the column. It blinked, a tiny, pulsing heartbeat on the screen, as if giving me one last chance to turn back, to live in blissful ignorance of the final tally. I took a breath, and I clicked. The number that appeared on the screen seemed to hum with a life of its own. It was stark, unforgiving, and utterly clear. 38,750美元. I leaned back in my chair, the worn leather groaning in the silence. Nearly $400,000. It wasn't help. It was a second life's worth of earnings, poured into a foundation that had just crumbled to dust. The sadness I'd felt in the shed was gone, burned away by the cold, hard light of this number. The hollow space in my chest was no longer empty. It was filled with a clarity so profound it felt like ice. I thought of Eleanor's warning all those years ago. We're adopting a house payment for the rest of our lives. She hadn't been cynical. She had been prophetic. I had made a bad investment, and as any good carpenter knows, when a part of a structure is rotten beyond repair, you don't keep patching it. You don't pretend it will hold. You cut it out, cleanly and completely, before it brings the whole house down. I saved the spreadsheet to my desktop, naming the file the ledger. Then I closed the laptop, my face calm in the soft glow of the lamp. I didn't know exactly what the next step was, but I knew with absolute certainty that it would not involve a hammer or a saw. It would involve a lawyer. I didn't sleep. I sat in the old leather armchair in my office until the first hints of gray light began to filter through the blinds, watching the numbers on the laptop screen glow in the dark. When I finally stood, my body was stiff, but my mind was lucid. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a hard, clear landscape. I walked into the kitchen and was greeted by the same scene of domestic carnage from the night before. The dirty plates, the abandoned glasses, the crumpled napkins. It was a physical manifestation of their disrespect, and I felt a flicker of something new not hurt, but a cold, surgical anger. I brewed a pot of coffee, drank a cup standing at the sink, and methodically ignored the mess. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I was a carpenter, a man of wood and steel, not of contracts and loopholes. My oldest friend, a plumber named Gary, had a son, Ben Carter, who'd become a lawyer. I remembered Gary boasting about him, how sharp he was, how he'd set up his own practice in the city. I found the firm, Carter Legal, online. The website was professional, with a picture of a smiling, confident-looking man in his late 30s. I dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. A receptionist answered, and I kept my voice steady and low. "I'd like to make an appointment with Mr. Carter. It's regarding a property and tenancy matter." She had a cancellation that very afternoon. It felt like a sign. The drive into Seattle was a gradual ascent from my world into another. The familiar, damp streets of Port Blossom, with their modest houses and overgrown gardens, gave way to the sprawling suburbs, and finally to the hard, vertical geometry of the city. I found a parking garage and walked the last few blocks, feeling anonymous in the bustling weekday crowd. The gray drizzle of my town was replaced by the city's indifferent energy, people with purpose and direction. I felt a kinship with them for the first time. I too now had a purpose. Ben Carter's office was on the 22nd floor of a glass and steel tower that scraped the sky. The view from the waiting room was immense, overlooking the gray-green expanse of Puget Sound. It was a place of power, a world away from half-eaten pot roast and family betrayals. Ben came out to greet me himself. He had his father's kind eyes, but a sharper, more focused energy. "Mr. Corrigan," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Ben, it's good to see you. My dad talks about you all the time." Inside his office, which was clean, modern, and uncluttered, I didn't waste time. I didn't come here for sympathy. I came for a strategy. I sat across the polished desk from him and pulled 2 documents from the folder I'd brought. The first was a copy of the house's deed, with my name listed as the sole owner. The second was a single sheet of paper I'd printed that morning, the spreadsheet I had named the ledger. I slid them across the desk. "This is the property," I said, pointing to the deed. "And this," I tapped the spreadsheet, "is my investment in it over the last 18 years. Ben put on a pair of reading glasses and studied the documents. He was silent for a long time, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers on the spreadsheet. He let out a low whistle. "Art, this is substantial." He looked up at me, his professional demeanor softening with genuine concern. "This is an incredible history of support. What happened?" I met his gaze and held it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let it crack. I delivered the facts as clinically as I had entered the numbers in my ledger. "Yesterday, at a family dinner, my daughter told me that the biggest relief in her life would be for me to be gone, to not have to worry about me anymore, in any capacity." I watched the words land. I saw the professional mask slip from Ben's face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He leaned back in his chair, taking his glasses off. "She said that to you?" I just nodded. That was all the confirmation he needed. He put his glasses back on, his expression shifting from shock to a kind of focused intensity. He was no longer just his father's friend. He was my lawyer. "Okay," he said, his voice now crisp and businesslike. He tapped the deed with his pen. "Legally, your position is ironclad. You are the owner of the property at 342 Maple Street. Your daughter and her family, without a formal lease agreement, are classified as tenants at will, or month-to-month tenants. You have every right to terminate that tenancy." "What does that entail?" I asked, my own voice sounding distant, like it belonged to the man on the 22nd floor, not the man from the quiet workshop in Port Blossom. "In Washington State, you are required to give them 20 days written notice before the end of a rental period. It has to be a formal written notice, no texts, no emails, a physical document. Once served, they have until the end of the following rental period to vacate the premises. If they fail to do so, we can begin formal eviction proceedings." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the quiet office. "Art, this is a profound step. Once you serve that notice, the family you have now will be gone forever. You need to be absolutely certain." A picture of Chloe's face, twisted with contempt, flashed in my mind. The image of the abandoned dinner table, The cold, hard number from the ledger, $387,450. The memory of Eleanor's prescient warning. I felt a surge of empowerment, a feeling so foreign it was almost dizzying. I was no longer a victim of their emotional whims. I was a client, and this was a transaction. I am more certain than I've been about anything in my life, I said. Draft the notice, Ben, please. Ben studied my face for a moment longer, saw the unshakable resolve in my eyes, and gave a single, decisive nod. All right, Art, I'll draft the notice to terminate tenancy immediately. I left his office an hour later with a new folder in my hand, this one containing the legal paperwork that would detonate my old life. Walking out of the building and back onto the busy city street, I felt taller. The city no longer felt anonymous or intimidating. It felt like an ally. I had a plan. I had the law on my side. And for the first time since Eleanor died, I felt completely and utterly in control of my own life. The drive back to Port Blossom felt different. The city skyline receded in my rearview mirror, a fortress of glass and steel where I had just armed myself. The folder from Ben's office sat on the passenger seat, its weight feeling far greater than that of a few sheets of paper. It was a declaration of war and a declaration of independence. As the landscape softened back into the familiar green and gray of the suburbs, the oppressive weight I usually felt returning home was gone. I wasn't driving back to my cage. I was a warden returning to a prison I was about to decommission. The drizzle had started again, but it didn't bother me. It was just water on a windshield. I pulled into my driveway in the late afternoon. The house was quiet, Derek's beat-up sedan noticeably absent. I let myself in, and the first thing I saw was the dining room table, still littered with the detritus of last night's disastrous meal. It was a perfect, infuriating monument to their entitlement. It was as if the argument had never happened, as if their monumental disrespect was just another chore they expected me to clean up. I walked past it without a second glance and went straight to my office. The folder from Ben went on the desk. I now had the legal instrument to remove them, but there was one more chain to break, one final act of severance that had to be done before I could truly be free. I sat down and woke up my old laptop. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the quiet, dusty room. My hands, which had been so steady in Ben's office, trembled slightly as I typed in the web address for my bank. This was, in its own way, more final than the legal notice. This was the point of no return. I logged into my account, a portal to a lifetime of careful saving and diligent work. Two numbers glowed on the screen. The first was my retirement account, the sum of 45 years of sweat and splinters. The second was the mortgage account for 342 Maple Street. I clicked on it. The remaining balance was $52,784.19. For 18 years, that number had been my burden, my secret responsibility. It was the anchor that kept me tied to their endless cycle of irresponsibility. Now, it looked different. It looked like a price tag, the price of my freedom. I navigated to the funds transfer page, my movements slow and deliberate, from Arthur Corrigan Retirement Fund to Maple Street Mortgage Account. Amount $52,780, $4.19. My finger hovered over the confirm transfer button. A lifetime of caution, of measuring twice, screamed at me to stop. This was a huge sum of money, a significant chunk of the nest egg Eleanor and I had so carefully built. What if something happened? What if I needed it? Was this an act of liberation or an act of reckless, emotional self-sabotage? Then, as clearly as if she were standing behind me, I heard Eleanor's voice, a memory from that night 18 years ago. We're adopting a house payment for the rest of our lives. And then, Chloe's voice, cold and sharp. The biggest relief would be not having to worry about you anymore. The doubt vanished, burned away by the clarity of those two truths. This wasn't reckless. This was a rescue mission. I was finally rescuing myself. I clicked the button. There was no fanfare, no fireworks, just a quiet loading icon, and then a new screen. Your payment has been scheduled for processing. An email notification pinged in my inbox almost instantly. The subject line was simple: Mortgage Payoff Confirmation. I opened it and hit print. The old printer in the corner whirred to life, groaning as it fed a single sheet of paper through its rollers. I took the page, still warm from the machine. The words were small, clinical, but they sang to me. paid in full. I leaned back in my chair, the paper in my hand. I didn't feel joy, not yet. The emotion was quieter, deeper. It was the profound, bone-deep relief of a man setting down a massive weight he didn't even realize he'd been carrying for decades. It was the silence, after years of noise. I looked at the confirmation slip, then out the window at the yard, at the massive fir trees that stood like silent witnesses. It was all mine now, not just legally, not just on paper, but spiritually. It was unburdened. I had scrubbed their debt, their need, their very claim from its foundation. I placed the mortgage confirmation on top of the legal notice from Ben. The two documents sat together on my desk, a matched set. One was the shield, the other was the sword. The power dynamic in this house hadn't just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably demolished, and I was the one left standing in the ruins, ready to build something new. I sat there in the deepening twilight of my office, the two documents lying on the desk like sealed orders. I had the power, the legal right, and the moral clarity. But a new practical problem began to surface. What would happen the moment I handed Chloe that envelope? The fallout would be immediate and catastrophic. There would be screaming, weeping, accusations, pleading. 18 years of resentment and dependence would erupt in a volcanic display of emotion, and I would be at the epicenter. The thought of enduring 20 days of that, of living under the same roof as their rage and desperation simmered, was suffocating. It would be a battle of attrition, and I was just too tired to fight anymore. Then a new thought, quiet and radical, entered my mind. What if I didn't have to be here for it? What if I just left? The idea wasn't about cowardice. It was about self-preservation. I had absorbed their emotional shrapnel for years. I didn't owe them an audience for their final, predictable performance. My eyes scanned the bookshelves, cluttered with a lifetime of objects, and landed on a small, dusty, silver-plated frame tucked behind a stack of carpentry manuals. I reached for it, my fingers tracing the ornate border. It was a photo of Eleanor and me on our honeymoon in Key West 45 years ago. We were so young. I had a full head of dark hair, and she was leaning against me, laughing into the sun, her face illuminated with a joy so pure it felt like I could still feel its warmth. I remembered the air, that thick, salty, floral-scented air, and the impossible turquoise of the water. It was the last time in my life I had felt completely and utterly carefree. The contrast between that sun-drenched memory and the gray, dripping world outside my window was a physical blow. Port Blossom was where I had my obligations, my history, my grief, the keys. That was where I had my joy. The decision wasn't even a decision. It was an instinct, a homing pigeon finding its way back to the only place it had ever known true peace. My hands moved with a new and unfamiliar speed on the laptop. I wasn't auditing the past anymore. I was booking the future. I pulled up a travel website, the colorful logos, a stark contrast to the drab interface of my online bank. Seattle to Key West. A flight left in 2 days, Thursday morning. It was impulsive, reckless, and felt more right than any decision I had made in the last 2 decades. I didn't hesitate. I selected the flight. Next, a place to stay. Not a noisy hotel on Duval Street, packed with tourists. I wanted solitude. I scrolled through vacation rentals, past pictures of garish condos and sprawling villas, until I found it. A small, private bungalow tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It was painted a cheerful seafoam green, with a white picket fence and a porch that held 2 rocking chairs, surrounded by overgrown bougainvillea. The listing called it the Mariner's Rest. The name felt like it was chosen for me. It had a small kitchen, a bookshelf full of old paperbacks, and was a 2-minute walk from a small, secluded beach. It was perfect. I entered my credit card information, the numbers flowing from memory. My finger hovered over the confirm booking button for only a second. This was the third and final click in my revolution. The first was the mortgage, the second, the flight. This one was the destination, the sanctuary. I clicked it. The confirmation pages loaded, with their cheerful graphics and itinerary numbers. It was done. In less than 48 hours, I would be gone. A wave of giddiness, an emotion so foreign I barely recognized it, washed over me. It was the thrill of rebellion. For the first time since Eleanor had passed, I was doing something that wasn't for Chloe or Derek or the kids. It wasn't about maintenance or responsibility or sacrifice. It was purely, selfishly, and beautifully for me. I looked at the picture of the little green bungalow on the screen, a beacon of light and warmth. Outside my window, the endless port blossom rain continued to fall, but it couldn't touch me anymore. I had a secret. I had an escape plan. Wednesday was a day of profound and unsettling silence. It was the quiet of a Cold War, a house full of people trying to occupy the same space without acknowledging one another's existence. Chloe and Derek moved like ghosts, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers the moment I entered a room. They didn't apologize. They didn't try to explain. They simply retreated behind a wall of sullen silence, their resentment a palpable force in the air. Their avoidance was a gift. It erased any lingering flicker of doubt and solidified the cold resolve that had taken root in my heart. They were making this easy. That afternoon, while they were out running some meaningless errand, I went to my office for the last time. This was the final piece of construction. I took out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery, the good paper Eleanor had saved for important correspondence, and my best fountain pen. This was not a letter written in the heat of anger or the depths of sorrow. This was a legal notification, a final closing statement on a failed 18-year investment, and it required a tone of detached finality. I wrote slowly, my hand steady, each word chosen with the precision of a master carpenter making his final, most important cut. I didn't begin with Dear Chloe. I didn't sign it Dad. This was not a message from a father to a daughter. It was a communication from a property owner to his tenants. Chloe and Derek. By the time you are reading this, I will be gone. I need some time away, and I am not certain when I will return. I want to inform you of two recent developments regarding this property. First, as of Monday, the outstanding mortgage on the house at 342 Maple Street has been paid in full. I own it outright. A copy of the bank's confirmation is enclosed for your records. Second, and as a direct result of our conversation on Sunday, I have decided to make a change. Enclosed you will find a legal notice to terminate tenancy, which has been drafted and filed by my lawyer, Ben Carter. As required by Washington state law, this serves as your official 20-day notice. You are required to vacate the premises completely by the end of the day on October 21st. This decision is not a negotiation, nor is it an invitation for discussion. It is a consequence. You expressed a desire for relief from the burden of my presence in your lives. I have now given it to you. Arthur Corrigan. I read it over twice. It was cold. It was clinical. It was perfect. It offered no emotional hooks for them to grab onto, no sentimental language to twist or use against me. It was a fortress of facts. I carefully folded the letter. Then I assembled the payload. First, the letter itself. Behind it, the printed confirmation from the bank, with the words PAIN full standing out like a brand. And last, the formal intimidating document from Ben's office, with its legal letterhead and official terminology. I slid all three into a large, unassuming manila envelope. My hand didn't shake as I sealed the flap. On the front I wrote their names in black, block letters, Chloe and Derek. Now, for the placement. It needed to be somewhere central, unavoidable, a disruption to their daily routine. The kitchen island was the obvious choice. I walked into the kitchen and placed the envelope squarely in the center of the butcher block, right where Chloe usually dropped the mail and her car keys. But it wasn't enough. It needed one final, symbolic touch. From the top shelf of the pantry, I retrieved Eleanor's old mixing bowl. It wasn't fine china. It was a heavy, stoneware bowl she had bought from a local potter, glazed in a deep cobalt blue. She had used it for everything. For baking bread, for mixing pancake batter on Saturday mornings, for holding apples from our tree in the fall. It was a vessel of our shared life, a symbol of the love and nourishment that had once filled this home. I dusted it off gently and placed it directly on top of the manila envelope. The bowl's significant weight pinned it firmly to the island. I stood back and looked at the scene. The plain, threatening envelope, held in place by an object of pure, uncomplicated love. To get to the consequence, they would first have to physically move the legacy. They would have to set aside the memory of the mother they revered in order to read the verdict delivered by the father they had dismissed. It was a silent, final statement, Everything was now in place. My suitcase was packed and waiting by the door in my bedroom. All that was left was the dawn. The alarm was set for 4, but I was awake at 3, my eyes open in the darkness. I dressed in silence, the stealth of a man who had spent a lifetime trying not to wake anyone up. Suitcase in hand, I walked down the dark hallway, past the closed doors of my daughter and my grandchildren. I felt a brief, sharp pang of sorrow for the kids, but it was a fleeting ache. I was no longer responsible for cushioning the blows of their parents' poor choices. Downstairs, the kitchen was bathed in the pale glow of the streetlight. There it sat on the island, the manila envelope, pinned beneath the heavy, dark blue of Eleanor's bowl. It looked like an offering on an altar. I moved around it carefully, as if it were a live explosive. The taxi's headlights cut through the misty darkness exactly at 4:30 a.m. As we pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back. The drive to SeaTac was a journey through shades of darkness into light. The airport was an island of harsh fluorescent reality in the pre-dawn gloom. The process was a blur of anonymous efficiency kiosk, bag drop, security. I was just another traveler, a gray-haired man in a flannel shirt, and the anonymity was a profound comfort. I got to my gate with an hour to spare, found a seat overlooking the tarmac, and I waited. At 7:05 a.m., right on schedule, my phone began to vibrate against my leg. The screen lit up. Chloe Mobile. My breath caught in my throat. She was awake. She had gone downstairs. She had seen the bowl. She had moved it. She had opened the envelope. I stared at the screen as it buzzed with a frantic, insistent energy. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it started again. And again. Voicemail notifications stacked up. Text message alerts pinged one after another, the preview banners flashing with furious capital letters and question marks. The phone was a hot, vibrating brick of her panic in my hand. The gate agent announced boarding would begin in 10 minutes. It was now or never. When the phone rang again, I took a deep, steadying breath, and I answered. "What is this?" The voice that came through the speaker was not my daughter's. It was a shrieking, unrecognizable torrent of rage and disbelief. I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Dad, what is this sick joke? A lawyer? Eviction? What did you do?" I waited for her to take a breath. My voice was so calm it seemed to belong to someone else. "It's not a joke, Chloe. You can't do this. You cannot do this to us. This is our home." "No," I said. The word was as cold and hard as a piece of steel. "It's my home. I have the paperwork to prove it." Her voice cracked, the rage giving way to manipulation. After everything we've been through, you're throwing us out on the street? Your own family? Your grandchildren?" I waited for a beat, letting her words hang in the air. My voice was unwavering. "You had a choice. You could have chosen gratitude. You could have chosen respect. You chose to tell me that my absence would be a relief." "I didn't mean it like that," she sobbed. The first group of passengers began to line up at the gate. My boarding zone was called. My voice was like ice. "It doesn't matter how you meant it. It's how I heard it." A short, deliberate pause. "You wanted relief, Chloe. You're getting it. Contact Ben Carter with any questions." "Dad, wait, please don't." I ended the call. And then I held down the power button until the screen went black. The connection was severed. The vibrating in my hand stopped. A profound, shuddering silence fell over me, and with it, a sense of release so total it almost brought me to my knees. I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked to the gate. I scanned my boarding pass, walked down the jet bridge, and stepped onto the plane, leaving the hurricane of her own making to rage 1,000 miles behind me. The 9-hour flight to Florida was a kind of peaceful purgatory. I sat in my window seat, my phone a dead, silent brick in my carry-on bag, and watched the world unfold beneath me. The dense, green, waterlogged landscape of the Pacific Northwest dissolved into the vast geometric patchwork of the heartland, and finally gave way to the sun-bleached coasts of the Gulf. I had brought a book, but I never opened it. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my mind was quiet. There were no problems to solve, no finances to juggle, no emotional minefields to navigate. Chloe's frantic, enraged voice was a fading echo from another world. I wasn't running from my life anymore. I was flying towards a new one, and the silence in my head was the sound of my own liberation. The moment I stepped off the jet bridge in Key West, The air itself was a welcome. It was a physical presence, a thick, warm, humid blanket, laced with the smell of salt and something sweet and floral I couldn't name. After the damp, perpetual chill of Port Blossom, it felt like my lungs were expanding for the first time. The colors seemed dialed up to a higher saturation. The impossible turquoise of the water I could see from the terminal window, the vibrant pinks of the hibiscus flowers spilling over the airport fences, the pale, sun-bleached blue of the sky. The pace of life was immediately different. No one was rushing. People moved with a languid, unhurried ease that felt like a different state of being. A taxi took me from the airport, the driver's radio playing a lazy reggae tune. We drove past colorful clapboard houses with wide porches and tin roofs. I found the Mariner's Rest exactly as the pictures had promised, a small seafoam green bungalow nearly hidden behind a riot of purple bougainvillea. I paid the driver, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. It smelled of sea salt and clean linen. It was simple, a comfortable-looking couch, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a ceiling fan turning slowly. I dropped my suitcase, walked through the living room, and slid open the glass door to the back porch. I sat down in one of the rocking chairs, and for the first time in 18 years, I felt completely and utterly at peace. The first 3 days were a sacrament of nothingness. I didn't set an alarm. I slept until the sun woke me, and I went to bed when the sky grew dark. My phone remained off, entombed in my suitcase. I walked to a small grocery store and stocked the kitchen with simple things: fruit, coffee, bread, cheese. I spent hours on the small, quiet beach at the end of the street, not swimming or even reading, just sitting on the warm sand, watching the gentle rhythm of the waves. I was shedding my old life like a thick, heavy coat I'd been forced to wear for too long. The weariness that had settled deep in my bones began to recede, replaced by the simple, profound rest my body and soul had been crying out for. On the 4th day, I felt a flicker of something new, curiosity. I walked down to a little beachfront shack that rented snorkeling gear. The young man who helped me was friendly and patient, showing me how to clear the mask. I felt clumsy and old as I waded into the warm, clear water. But the moment I put my face beneath the surface, the world disappeared. There was only silence, the sound of my own breathing, and a universe of impossible color. Schools of electric blue damselfish darted through coral canyons. A parrotfish nibbled on an algae-covered rock, and a lone barracuda hung suspended and menacing in the middle distance. I was an observer in a silent, beautiful world that had existed long before my problems and would exist long after them. It was a kind of meditation, and I stayed in the water until my back was pink from the Sunday after. I fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were for exploring. I discovered a small marina where weathered fishing boats bobbed in their slips. It was there I met Sal, a man who looked to be my age, but was so tanned and leathery from the sun he seemed carved from driftwood. He was mending a net on the deck of his boat, the No Regrets. I commented on his handiwork, and we struck up a conversation. We didn't talk about our pasts or our families. We talked about tides, and the best bait for grouper, and the time he'd seen a waterspout off the Marquesas Keys. His presence was simple, uncomplicated. A few days later, he invited me to go out with him, not on a charter, but just to keep him company. We spent a whole afternoon on the water, sharing a thermos of coffee and not saying much at all. The easy silence was more comforting than any conversation I'd had in years. One afternoon, I found a beautiful piece of silvery driftwood on the beach. I took it back to my porch and spent the rest of the day carving it with the pocket knife I always carried. My hands, which had built so much out of obligation, moved with a forgotten joy. I wasn't building a bookshelf or fixing a cabinet. I was just following the grain of the wood, carving the shape of a leaping dolphin, for no other reason than the pleasure of doing it. I was rediscovering the man I had been before I had become a function, a utility, a wallet. I was just art. A man who liked the smell of sawdust and salt. A man who could appreciate the quiet company of another. A man who found peace in the silent world beneath the waves. One evening, sitting on the porch of the little green bungalow, a cold beer in my hand, I watched the sun melt into the ocean, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. A genuine, unforced smile spread across my face. The anger I had carried out of Port Blossom was gone, washed away by the tide. The hurt had been healed by the Sunday. I felt a sense of gratitude so profound, It made my chest ache a gratitude for the silence, for the beauty, for this second chance. I had bought my freedom, and it turned out it looked a lot like this. My last morning in the Keys dawned clear and bright. I woke without an alarm, my body now attuned to the rhythm of the Sunday. I made a final pot of coffee and took it out to the porch, sitting in the rocking chair that had become my throne of reflection. I watched the sky blush from gray to pink, to a brilliant, cloudless blue. There was a gentle sadness in knowing I was leaving, the kind you feel at the end of a good book, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of gratitude. This small, seafoam green bungalow had been more than a rental. It had been a crucible. The man who had arrived 2 weeks ago, a hollowed-out shell of anger and grief, had been reforged in its warmth and quiet. Packing was a simple, meditative task. As I folded the Hawaiian shirts I'd bought on a whim, I saw the faded patches on the shoulders where the sun had bleached them. I carefully wrapped the small driftwood dolphin I'd carved in a t-shirt and placed it in my suitcase. I was packing up a different man than the one who had arrived. The old Art was tense, burdened, and perpetually braced for the next disappointment. This new version of me was lighter. The stoop in my shoulders was gone. The permanent knot of anxiety in my stomach had dissolved. I was returning to Port Blossom, but I was not returning to my old life. Sitting on the edge of the bed, surrounded by my packed belongings, a new and powerful clarity washed over me. The plan had always been to go back and simply... what? Live in that big, empty house, a silent monument to a family that had imploded? The thought of it, of walking those halls full of ghosts and echoes of arguments, felt like a step backward. The Keys had taught me that I didn't need 4 bedrooms and a 2-car garage. I didn't need the constant gray drizzle as a backdrop to my life. I needed sunlight. I needed peace. The decision solidified in an instant, as clear and solid as a piece of cured oak. I would sell the house. I would sell everything I didn't need, pack up what was left, and find my own small version of the Mariner's Rest, somewhere the sun shone more days than it didn't. Before heading to the airport, I made one last stop at the marina. Sal was on his boat, splicing a rope, his gnarled hands moving with an expert's grace. I told him I was leaving. He just nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Figured," he said. "You got that look about you, the one folks get when they remember who they are." He squinted at me, his eyes the color of the pale sea. "You go on then, Art. Just don't forget what the sun feels like on your face." We shook hands, a simple, solid gesture between 2 men who understood each other without needing many words. The flight home was the mirror image of the one that brought me here. I wasn't fleeing into the unknown. I was a man with a clear mission, returning to wrap up a final piece of business. I opened my book and actually read it this time, the words flowing easily. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the familiar sprawling blanket of gray clouds appeared below us. But it didn't look like a prison anymore. It just looked like a place. A place where I had a house to sell and a new life to begin. The taxi ride back to Port Blossom was quiet. I felt a flutter in my stomach, but it wasn't the old, sick feeling of dread. It was a nervous excitement, the kind a builder gets just before he starts demolition on a site to make way for a new foundation. I didn't know what I would find. Had they left peacefully? Had they trashed the place in a fit of rage? Was there a final, angry confrontation waiting for me? The old Art would have been paralyzed by these questions. The new Art, the man who had faced the silent judgment of the Barracuda and felt the steady friendship of an old fisherman, knew he could handle whatever was waiting for him behind that front door. As the taxi turned onto Maple Street, I leaned forward, looking at the house from a distance. It was no longer a home. It was an asset, and it was time to liquidate. The taxi pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. I paid the driver, my eyes fixed on the house. It was dark. No lights glowed in the windows. No cars sat in the drive. The kids' bicycles, usually strewn across the lawn, were gone. A profound, almost unnerving stillness had settled over the property. It was the quiet of a place that has been abandoned. I pulled my suitcase up the familiar walkway, the wheels rattling loudly in the evening silence. The key felt strange in my hand, as if it belonged to a different house, a different life. It slid into the lock and turned smoothly. I pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, cold, and still. My fingers found the light switch on the wall by memory. The lights flickered on, revealing an emptiness so vast and absolute it stole my breath. It was all gone. Their oversized sofa, the cheap coffee table, the massive flat-screen television vanished. The only thing left in the living room was my old leather recliner, the one Eleanor had given me for my 50th birthday. It sat alone in the middle of the vast beige carpet like a solitary survivor on a barren island. I dropped my suitcase and began a slow, deliberate tour, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. They hadn't trashed the place in a fit of rage, which surprised me. But it wasn't clean either. It had been emptied with a grim, hurried efficiency. Scuff marks scarred the walls where furniture had been dragged away. In the kitchen, Eleanor's deep blue bowl was sitting on the counter, a silent testament to the moment their world changed. Taped to the refrigerator door was a single sheet of paper, ripped from a spiral notebook. Chloe's handwriting was a furious, jagged scrawl. I pulled it free and read the short, poisoned message. I hope you and your money are very happy together. You chose a house over your own family. Don't ever try to contact me or my children again. You are nothing to us now. I read the note twice. There was no apology, no flicker of self-awareness, just the same tired, self-pitying narrative where she was the victim. The words that once would have shattered me now felt hollow, weightless. They were the final, impotent shots from a battle that was already over. I felt a brief, sharp pang of pity for her, for a woman so trapped in her own story she couldn't see the truth. Then, I calmly folded the note into a neat square, dropped it into the empty kitchen trash can, and let it go. Upstairs, the emptiness was even more pronounced. Faint, pale rectangles on the walls marked where posters had once hung in the kids' rooms. I saw a few stray Lego bricks in a corner, and felt a brief ache, not for the family I had lost, but for the grandchildren caught in the crossfire. Standing in the empty hallway, I took a deep breath. The house didn't feel haunted. It felt clean. The oppressive weight of years of tension and unspoken resentments had been lifted. The emptiness wasn't a loss. It was a possibility. It was a blank canvas. I walked from room to room, throwing open every window, letting the cool Port Blossom air rush in, purging the last ghosts of their presence. I took my phone out of my pocket. I navigated to my call log and text messages, the screen still full of the frantic notifications from 2 weeks ago. Without reading a single one, I deleted the entire history. Then I went to my contacts, found Chloe's name, and pressed block contact. I did the same for Derek. A simple, quiet, digital execution. The final tie was severed. I walked back downstairs and stood in the center of the vast, empty living room. My eyes fell on my faithful old recliner, the sole keeper of my history in this house. I walked over to it, the leather sighing as I sat down. I leaned my head back and looked around at the blank walls, the empty doorways, the clean slate that surrounded me. And a slow, quiet, genuine smile spread across my face. It wasn't the triumphant grin of a man who had won a war. It was the peaceful, contented smile of a man who had finally, after a long and weary journey, come home. A few weeks later, the house was no longer empty. It was in a state of purposeful transition. The stark, echoing silence had been replaced by the productive sounds of a life being packed up. Crisp autumn sun streamed through sparkling clean windows, a stark contrast to the endless gray drizzle that had once defined this place. I was leaning against the kitchen counter, on the phone with the realtor, looking out at the yard. "No, the foundation is solid rock, Karen," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I built the deck myself in '08, all cedar. It'll outlast both of us. Yes, the asking price is firm. I know what it's worth." After I hung up, I stood for a moment, sipping my coffee. The house was no longer a home filled with ghosts. It was a property, my biggest investment, and it was finally time to cash out. Later that afternoon, I was in the office, carefully wrapping old photographs. I picked up the silver-framed picture of Eleanor from the Oregon coast, her laughter still seeming to echo from the glossy paper. I thought of Chloe then, not with anger, but with a quiet, distant sadness. I had spent a lifetime trying to solve the puzzle of her, only to realize that some pieces are just meant to be broken. I couldn't fix her, and for the first time I truly accepted that. My duty was no longer to the daughter she had become, but to the memory of the woman in this photograph, and to the peaceful life she would have wanted for me. My gaze drifted to the living room mantelpiece. In the center, catching a ray of sun, was the small driftwood dolphin I had carved in the keys. It was a simple, imperfect thing, but it was the first object I had made for pure joy in almost 20 years. Next to it was a brochure for a small condo community near the water, just north of Key West. The pictures showed a simple pool, a dock for fishing, and modest but bright little homes. It looked peaceful. It looked possible. I walked to the living room window, the photo of Eleanor still in my hand. I looked at her smiling face, forever young in the coastal wind, and then looked out at the golden autumn light bathing the familiar trees of Port Blossom. My journey here was almost over. A new one was about to begin. Chloe's last, bitter words echoed in my mind one final time. You chose a house over your family. She was wrong. I didn't choose a house. I chose myself. I chose a life free from resentment and expectation. For 18 years, I had poured my money, my time, and my heart into this place. Now, it was finally going to pay me back, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with the freedom it gave me. A real peaceful smile spread across my face, unburdened and full of a light I thought I had lost forever. The horizon was waiting.